So remember this in closing, my friends. Always remember this. The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist.
Brutal. Yeah, that was truly brutal. And now it's time for me to share my top 10 brutal death metal records on this episode of Don't Let Me Into My Zone. Let's get this brutal show started.
Don't let him into his zone. Don't let him into his zone. You just let him into his music nerd zone.
Hello everyone, this is your brutal, busiest internet music nerd VTuber MB, and today we'll be checking out my top 10 brutal death metal albums. Honestly, I feel like I would have a more concrete top 10 when I was in my metal only phase a handful of years back, because I always remember listening to all the new metal releases, but my favorites were especially the brutal death metal ones. Yes, I understand that a few of these records you would consider slam, but honestly, both slam and normal brutal death metal are awesome. God dang metalheads and their micro subgenres. Anyways, let's get through this. Let's get this brutal party started. Number 10. And here's number 10. To start off this brutal adventure, we have Mortal Decay's album, Forensic. This record is an interesting blend of old school and modern with some technical elements with death metal, with some amazing drumming. This is usually the case with brutal death metal. The drums will always be a highlight in the music, but in the case for Forensic, this record almost feels like it's an evolved version of brutal death metal, while giving you some genuine nostalgia from the old school sound. I do like my brutal death metal brutal, but I do really love it whenever I get like things spiced up a bit, with something a little new and something a little old to go along with it. Now it's time for us to move on to record number 9. Number 9, Afterbirth, The Time Traveler's Dilemma. Afterbirth is a brutal death metal band that has been around since the 90s, but has only been really pumping out demos and smaller recordings, but it wasn't until 2017 when the band decided to drop their first official debut album with the former vocalist of Artificial Brain, another great death metal band. And with this one, it's just a great sci-fi blend of brutal death metal and slam. The vocals are great, the instrumentation is great, and I just love the album art and the concept, because we all know how brutal time travel can get. But that dilemma, putting it into a brutal death metal record, makes it especially cool. So with all that, we move on to number 8. Number 8, Annihilation of the Wicked. Yes, Nile is probably like one of the most famous brutal death metal bands. Yes, for the brutality, brutal, but mostly due to the fact that all their music revolves around the brutal ancient Egyptian history, and oh boy, aside from that being really brutal and cool. I honestly just love this Nile record due to some of the monolithic brutal songs. I mean that by length, but also just because this record is probably Nile's best record to show off how brutal they are while being backed by ancient Egypt. Now we move on to number 7. Number 7 is a bit of a brutal doozy because it's technically 2 records. Disposable of the Dead, Dharmata by Defeated Sanity. Mostly this group from Germany has been well known for their slamming brutal music. But for this record, Defeated Sanity has decided to give a tribute to both brutal death metal and classic death metal like Death. In this album, both sides have a lot to offer for fans of brutal and old. So honestly, I feel like this warrants a listen from any death metal fan. And with that, I will move on to number 6. That is definitely not a double album. Well, congrats New Jersey! You have a band that made one of the most avant-garde but coolest slamming brutal records out there. Number 6 is Disintegration of Thought Patterns During a Synthetic Mind Traveling Bliss. Wow, that's a doozy, by Dripping. But aside from that, really long, cool title and cool album art, this is probably one of the most coolest avant-garde slamming brutal death metal albums out there. I know that some folks would say that the toilet room sounding production on the vocals turned them off, but for me, I'll just say it adds to the experience, and then honestly, it just makes it sound more brutal and cooler. Let us move on to number 5 now. Exodermist by Wormed. Number 5. Here's the music that Isaac Clarke from Dead Space would be listening to while he's getting dragged out into space by a freaking alien tentacle. But aside from that, this music is just cosmic horror, not Lovecraft, with a lot of breathing and great guitar work. I still find Wormed to be one of the coolest brutal bands out there, and truly, Exodermist is the one record that shows us off, along with those awesome guitar riffs. Now let us move on to number 4.
I command thee to rip of the dead.
I command thee to servitude.
You know what? I can get away with that part of this album being the reason why I put this on number 4. And you know what? I will, because it is really brutal and great enough to make Barbarous Content by Eternal Bleeding this high on my list. Reign Supreme by Dying Fetus is number 3 on this top 10 list. Dying Fetus is a legend in the extreme metal scene, overall influencing a lot of the scene. But even so, this offensive naming band never slowed down with their brutal, awesome music. Reign Supreme is proof of that, as it subjects you to a beating, haha, just like the song in this album, subjected to a beating. Okay, well, brutal riffs, drums, and vocals, it truly is a perfect example to show you how amazing this band is. Now let's go on to number 2. I know this is probably one of the most famous brutal albums out there, and I can get it with how inhumane Lorworm vocals are on this record, but once again, aside from the amazing guitar work and drumming, this record has a reason to be an iconic brutal record, because nothing other than it's so vile, except maybe some slam records with themes and album art that would get any user nuked on here if they frickin' well, probably just me, but aside from that, now it's time to move on to the most brutal death metal record of all time. Number 1, the mother of all brutality, the mother of all slam riffs. It's thanks to Suffocation in this record to why some of the most brutal bands exist today. It does make me sad that Frank Mullen, probably one of my favorite brutal vocalists of all time, is retiring, but you know what? I gotta thank him and the rest of the band mates for making not only my favorite brutal death metal record of all time, but one of my favorite records of all time. And that concludes this brutal music review. Quite glad I'm able to go really brutal and varied with my music reviews, but like I said, I am the internet's busiest music nerd VTuber. I do think if I wasn't around as a VTuber, I would still be consuming loads of music alongside with these brutal riffs. But hey, you know what? I gotta share these awesome brutal riffs somehow, and this is the best way I can. Thank you all for watching this brutal review, and stay brutally bass. Bye.